I should also do this in English because the lecture is going to be in English, so don't worry. So Steffen, hi, welcome to Playpublik. Director of G-Lab, very inspiring game designer. Great work. I'm really looking forward to your lecture talk tonight. And yeah, here's the microphone.
Thanks, Sebastian. Thanks, Playpublik people, for having me. I'm going to talk about something that I call the politics of gameful spaces. What that is, we'll find out. I've collected a couple of examples to sort of illustrate what I mean by that, and it's really funny for me because, as Sebastian said, there's an exhibition piece that's here in the museum, which is kind of weird because it makes you think, am I that old already to be exhibited in a museum, and what does that mean for me as a person? And I'm not sure yet. I haven't found out yet what that means, but it's a really weird feeling actually. But everything must go, and we need to embrace change. So I was thinking to take the term gameful space rather, literate, and say, well, from an architectural standpoint, you could say there's all kinds of, buildings and structures out there, and all of them are, you could say, sort of playful or gameful, and that they invite, I guess, someone to do something there that's out of the ordinary, and that's fun. And so we've got wave breakers here that are painted. And we've got the Experience Music Project, which is in itself sort of, playful because you can play instruments and la la la. And you've got a slide here, and there's a really interesting building in Munich, the Mensa of the TU Munich, that also has a big slide. Don't know if you know that. And then there's stuff like this, an off-balance sphere. It looks like that big ball is going to fall down, but, so this is basically architecture that's sort of playful, I guess. And then you've got something like this. This is in Melbourne, in Carlton, a really cool bakery. That's sort of, I'm not sure what it is, but it's not ordinary, and I guess it's playful. I always feel like throwing things in there, trying to hit the shells, or in them. And so, perhaps more concretely, playful would be something like this: an appropriation of something that exists. That's one way to look at things, right? Of gamefulness, playfulness. An appropriation of something that's already there, that you use for something that it's not been intended for. That could be interesting. Well, jumping on these things, jumping from one thing to the other, trying to be a parkour artist at one point. Then perhaps we've got the category of the intervention, where we've got an artist, Bruce Wilson, who's installing these things, like swings and little elements into places that are not really made for that. But then, on the other hand, if you really think about it, like a bus stop, it's perfect for that, right? Because it's sort of this in-between transitional thing where you go, oh yeah, well, what could I do? I mean, you could just like do what everyone else does these days, like look at your smartphone and try to not be at where you are, but that's us these days. We're not where we are. We're always wanting to be somewhere else. And here you can be perfectly where you are. And yeah, I like that. Interesting. Well, you could also say there's another category where people have been, in architecture in particular, imagining how things could be. For things to be very different, right? This is a sketch by NL Architecture, an office in the Netherlands. Yeah, why not? Now, here's something that's very interesting to me. If we build something like that, what would our cars look like? What would we need to do in order to make this something that people would get used to, right? What would we need to make this something that we would like to master? What would be the slowest possible pace to try this? What would be the fastest? Who would have the coolest and the biggest car? Who'd have the smallest vehicle? those questions are interesting, I think. But then it's, it's a thought experiment. Now, you could also say there's another category where you use media and technology. So this is a project that I did many years back. And it's scary to think of it, but it's 11 years now. Where we said, we've got a space, a school space in that case, a university in Zurich. And we ran the series of experiments where we sort of gave out these smartphones, what were they called? Pocket PCs. That even in itself sounds so outdated and old. Pocket PC. And those pocket PCs were equipped with a wireless LAN things that you had to put on extra. And then we built this fake bomb. And a nuclear bomb that we built after plans that you could find in the internet that day. And then we asked a couple of people to sort of try to find that bomb that was hidden in the building somewhere, and to sort of group up with other people. And then they got phone calls at certain times, at a certain phone booth. They had to find websites that were hidden, that had puzzles in it. So it was sort of a mixture of what you would call today like a pervasive game, maybe a street game, with an ARG, an alternate reality game, sort of mixed in. And we ran this for a couple of days, and ultimately you had to find the bomb. And the plot was that every time we ran a session, one in the group was a saboteur, someone who had been assigned to hinder everyone else to sort of solve that problem, solve the puzzle. And that created a very strong social reaction, like where people were assuming, you, the saboteur, I'm gonna, put you into that basement and lock the door for a couple hours. And that's what happened. So it's a social experiment, really. We tried this because we also wanted to know how people would trust one another across media. Yeah, so we called this hybrid reality because, I don't know. It's still up there, so it's well documented, so have a look. Also, when talking about spaces and gameful spaces, I guess something that I find hindering is to only think of them as in physical or, virtual. It's just mixes, right? So these mixes are interesting, and sometimes it's just about, I guess, trying to make something more gameful that's just a regular website. So a couple years back, I did this thing where I said, here's a website, but in order to browse that website, people can play little games. Arcade games. So actually what you do here is you can still go there. You need the Flash plugin, sorry for that, it's so miserable. So you play like a killer game, you shoot little parachutes, and that way you open subsides of the website, or you sort of play a Arkanoid style game where you sort of hit the bricks, and whenever you hit bricks that opens subsides. So each of these games, little arcade style games, are really speaking to alluring, really, certain player types that we as game designers think are, out there. Socializer, the killer, someone who's very competitive, the socializer who's only wanting to do social things, which is in this case, you get these little bunnies here that you have to pet, and the more you pet them, the more they will like you and then open these sites for you. Anyways, so that's a space where I guess you could say it's a browser space, I guess. We did something then, again, with a lot of tech early on, before there was the iPhone and all these things, where we created a tourist experience in 2006 called Rexplorer. That's exhibited here, which is kind of weird again, but where you could rent a device that we custom built. It was a cell phone, but it had a certain aluminum shell around it, and we built the interface and la 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 la. And what you could do in this game is that you sort of walk around at your own pace, design your own adventure. And you've got 30 hotspots all around the city that are GPS tracked, and they are, at the same time, some of them, because this is a very old city, Regensburg, right? Have you been? Who's been to Regensburg? Old, yeah. It's a very old city. One of the few cities that, weren't bombed, really. So you design your own adventure by going to these places, and then you get quests, and you had to do, certain gestures. And I can show you this with this little movie. Yeah, movie! And the goal was really to let people who are really bored with sightseeing tours, to let them sort of try out something else that's a game, and to speak to, a younger audience, I guess. Not kids, but like people like your age, I guess. And for each player, we created a website that would show all the places that they've been to, the routes that they've taken in the city, and the quests that they've taken on at one of those 30 spots. And at the spots, you could sort of use the device with a spell casting mechanism. You could cast real spells by waving it around in the air, and then that would sort of wake up a historical character, accurate character for that very building, and that character would assign you with certain quests, like go deliver that love letter to my friend. I haven't spoken to her in like 400 years, and can you please do this for me? Yeah, and then in the end, everyone would get a website, and that was kind of, people like this. This was commercially available for 1.5 years. It was really very sort of experimental, but yeah, early on. So you can imagine that stuff like, Foursquare, all these kinds of services, sort of like, this is, I guess, one of the precursors of that kind of thinking, I guess. So, yeah. It was very audio-based because at that time the displays of the cell phones sucked. They were just, we had to make it very contoury and black and white, monochromatic, and yeah. We put on the glittery stuff afterwards, obviously, but just in case you wonder. Yep. So there's a lot of talk, I guess, these days about tourism, and there's a really interesting service now these days called Gidzi, where who's aware of Gidzi? You do, you are. So where you can become a tour guide, I guess, and someone who's offering a service in any given city. So that's because what I really like is to think, what's the next step? How can you sit on top of things, And one of the things that I like about Gidzi is that it's sort of saying, well, instead of you sort of authoring how people should experience this, and this is a sort of like very highly authored thing, right? It's not like design your own quest, which would also have been sort of the next step, and someone did this already actually, but they went bankrupt 2 years ago, where you could design your own GPS quests for others to play. But one of the next steps Gidzi is doing, saying, well, everyone can be a tour guide, and everyone knows the city so well that you can offer something. You could say, well, I know the best restaurant around the corner. I know all the cool, I don't know, where the cool kids play basketball in the evening, right? That kind of thing. So that's really interesting about Gidzi, I think. So, yeah. So, tourism thing. It's over now. Thank God. And so you'll see like an example of the web pages that we saw, that we put together. Basically like a geoblog, a succession of places that people have been to. Yeah. So that was Explorer. Something that I'm doing with my lab, I should say, the G Lab, the Games and Experimental Entertainment Lab, we're part of the largest Australian university, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, in Melbourne, obviously. No, it's not in Melbourne, it's in Sydney, Steffen. We're bringing the Games for Change Festival. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a large festival. It's been running for, I think, 9 years now in the US, in New York, and we're bringing this festival to Melbourne. And so we're making this, and I think one of the reasons that we're trying to do this, and Games for Change is about addressing social issues with the help of games, or sort of giving games a forum that sort of address social topics, I guess, and that are trying to make a difference, other than just entertaining people. And What we're doing with Games for Change is we're wanting it to address city topics. Topics such as waste in the city, youth, policy making, civic participation, that kind of stuff. And so that's the theme of the festival. And why is this interesting in the context of Melbourne? Well, because Melbourne's been voted most livable city in the world, which really means that you need to have a lot of money to have a really good life there, ultimately, because it really addresses, of course, like, where do these indexes come from? Well, they come from the Economist intelligence unit that pays people, consultants, a lot of money to speak to bosses, CEOs from companies, to find out how much money you need to pay someone extra in order to live in a place. And then they sort of try to find the factors that make this a livable place. You know, and it's always attached to cost of living. And ultimately what we're trying to find out is, and the city of Melbourne is our partner in this, this is a very good move and really cool move by them. What we're trying to find out is, how is it that such a city that sort of is claimed by others to be a really livable place could be a really livable place for everyone? You know? And could this be through games or playful activities or participation? If games are really good at something, it's about making people want to participate in an activity. So that's something that we're trying to engage people in here. Now, what the hell, what the fuck does this all have to do with my theme today? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because when I, as a designer, design something, I'm trying to think about the agenda that I bring with me. Because all designers have an agenda. Sometimes they just say, well, you know, I want to entertain people. I want them to experience fun. Fun is in the eye of the beholder. I want them to, I don't know, run around and think it's awesome. But I think a lot of games that you're seeing these days, and because of the widespread allure and also availability of smartphones and devices that can play back games wherever you are, and that's why how games sort of become very physical, and they are becoming attached to the spaces that we roam around. I think it's very important that we sort of check back and say, what's your agenda? And this is really what I want you to take with you today, is to always question, what's the agenda? Don't just take things for granted. Don't think it's cool that, you know, you okay Facebook to just, you know, steal your privacy data. It's not stealing them, you get something back, you know, a lot of friends. So what's the agenda? Well, the agenda certainly is not, as in this ambigram, that reality is fantasy, because if you turn around, that says reality. I kind of like ambigrams. The agenda is this. Designers have objectives, perhaps they want to entertain, and that's fine, I can see that, that's all good. And objectives inform rules, the way that something plays out. And rules create games, and players experience them. That's fine. Kevin Slevin, who's going to speak from today's, typically says algorithms govern our lives. Algorithms are really rules, ultimately, that you tell the computer to execute. And gameful activities have and take space and time. And now, because of that, space and time too, but that's another matter, and we're not going to talk about it today because it's quite a thing, is subject to rule-based politics. And then there's other stuff too, you know, like urban planners who say you can't do this here and you cannot do this there. And then ultimately all this affects designers, which means that we're taking a full circle again, right? Because then designers have objectives and they make them into games, and that's kind of weird. Well, think about this a little bit. It's the typical thing that anthropologists will tell people, everything is a loop, you know. Now the question is, really, and I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit, which side are you on? Are you on the dark side of the moon where the Nazis have set up camp with helium-3? If you've watched Iron Sky, as I did 2 days or 3 days ago, I was very impressed with that movie. It's not necessarily a good movie, but an interesting sort of setting. Anyways, so we've come full circle, but you can decide if you want to empower people or if your agenda is to control. Now the question is, what do you use this control for? How do you exert that control? Be aware of that. If you're designers, you need to know that this is exactly what you're doing. So really, again, I'm questioning gameful spaces. What's the agenda? Some of this I've studied in a book that you can get for free. I would not try to sort of pitch you getting that book unless it was for free. So you can get it for free. It's called Toward Ludic Architecture. And there I studied all kinds of spaces that sort of have been used as spaces, sites of playful and gameful activities. Like the playground, that's rather obvious, right? Playgrounds are around. You know what's really interesting? The playground in the context of the city bars children from being run over by cars. That's what it ultimately does. It concentrates the play activity to a certain overseeable, highly controllable ground, right? Everything on the playground is controlled. The wood, the stuff that you straw onto the ground, the way that it's all DIN certified. It has to be, because we want to exert control of the kids, right? Is that a good thing? Well, from the city perspective, from sort of the protective parental perspective, yes it is. Well, from another perspective, it's really shitty, right? Because we don't let them run around, roam around, do as they please. Sometimes they just do, and then they end up, you know, drug addicts or something, we've been told. So, without further ado, in that book, I do this. I make a lot of connections between all these spaces, and I know this is very overwhelming, and it's sort of like, I don't know, yeah, it says, like, the city and the way the city's been made in Europe has a lot to do with how in many early times, in medieval times, in the Italian city in particular, mid-Italian city, people were fighting games every once in a while, representing their cherishes. And this was a very, very important thing for them to do, because they could use, you know, they could punch someone else in the face, something that they could not do throughout the year, but for that very certain time they could. And through that way, clubs came to life, football clubs even, that we still watch today on television, fancy them. And the way these games were sort of forming society was integral to the understanding of the city as being a cherish against another cherish. A parish, I'm sorry. So, but this is really about power, I guess, and how things connect. Now I was thinking, how can I give you a concrete example of a gameful space that is not just like some weird experiment, something that's forever and ever, it's been around in our minds and that's just pervasive. And I thought for a little bit, and I was like, well, that's easy, Steffen, because we've got this. Now this is a little puzzle for you, a riddle, I guess. What do you think I'm looking for here? What is it that I'd like to talk about? Olympics. The Olympic Games. The Olympic Games are games. They are a gameful space because they're making a whole city into a controlled, surveilled place for the purpose of people running around for 50 kilometers and then drop dead. No, that doesn't happen anymore. But now, really think about this a little bit. Olympic Park. Cities these days, apart from LA and Atlanta a little bit, spend way more money than they get back over time for getting these Olympic Games. They claim that this is all good for urban development, but what it's really good for is to make builders very rich, to make the Olympic Games organization very rich, to make television stations very rich, and to exert control. And how do they do that? In this case, it's a very obvious thing, and I'm so happy that Friedrich is here today, because this part of the city and whole London has become the highest surveilled place on the earth. And now that is through by the way of those games. Isn't that really exciting? Doesn't that show how you can go either or? You can either empower people or you can exert control, power over them. Now, very quickly, here's a short movie that shows how they build. And of course these games come with, and that's very concrete architecture talk again, they of course always come with symbols of power. That's no news for architects, like that's what we do, we build big things, penises and that kind of thing, you know. Sometimes vaginas, not really necessarily interested in vaginas, really interested in big penises. And so, or in wings, as you have here. So this is the aquatic center, I think. So over time, they built these gigantic, you know, structures, and it's really interesting. I dug a little bit into research that looks into the economics of the Olympic Games and how it changes space and how it changes the city and how it affects the city. Here's one finding, interesting finding. And it's not just about the Olympic Games, it's about mega events, as they're called, or they call them mega events. The Germany World Cup in 2006, there was a big empirical study about, did this event make people happier? The Germans. The Germans. Did it make the Germans happier? Yes, it did. They said, we were really happy because the event was so grand, and you know, we were all partying and celebrating. I partied, I liked it. Now, a lot of the other research that's conducted never asks about happiness. It really asks, was there any purpose? Is there anything left now 10 years after? The only city that really says this is true is the city of Atlanta, because they said we've got MARTA, which is the public transportation system, and we've sort of developed the North Line. A lot of other and the Chinese, of course, they say yes, it's all great. You know, it was very good for us. And a lot of other cities say, well, it's money, it's spent, and we don't sometimes even know what to do with the stadia because, well, we don't have other mega events. Do you see the sort of logic? That's like, it's a flaw. So, what I really like about the Olympic Park is how gruesome and how socialist it looks, and how I would not want to live there. Would you? This is the Olympic Village. These are the beds. Excellence, friendship, and respect. Yes. I subscribe to that. Now, what I also found very funny is, if you really start to think about this, is like, hey, the Olympic Games, they're gamified. We've got a leaderboard. Yay! We're following all this. I do follow this. I don't even watch the games. I don't fucking care, right? I couldn't care less. And I'm a game researcher and game designer, but I'm very fascinated with the leaderboard. I want to know who just won the medals and how Germany is doing. Very bad this time. So, to really wrap this up, I found this very nice quote. Sums up my thoughts. And what I want to tell you is that, again, watch the agenda. Here, you could argue that perhaps, you know, apart from the fun that comes with the event, and certainly the competition and the meeting of the youth and the world, you know, this was a very, very awesome opportunity for surveillance industry to install these surveillance things, and they will sustain, they will be there. And I also thought that if you have a lot of, you know, control over what's happening, that perhaps takes us back to one of the interesting motives that lie sort of underneath all game design, which is, in one case, to really exert control. So I found this, just to give you a little bit of a provocative, I guess, hopefully provocative ending. A new game coming up by Introversion called Prison Architect, where your objective is, of course, to build a prison and to exert control over people. And yeah, it's a sim. It's prison sim, you could say. Of course, people here in the room who know their game history will know that these types of games have been around, even worse, like concentration camp, simulations, that kind of thing. And this is really a company in England, and they want to make this a big game. So I'll jump this because I'm running out of time. There's plentiful of other examples where architects these days are using their new way I'd say, a new way of talking about how to make things more playful. Again, watch the agenda here. This is even a good friend of mine, Jürgen Meyer-Ha, a very good architect from Berlin. But the way that they're looking at this is a Palm Springs community that they're building at the moment, Boom, where there will be playgrounds for adults. You can hang out with other people. You can connect. There will be your own social network of how you can liaise with other people. And yeah, so it's a new. I sort of feel that it's a new thing. So to finally wrap this up, I'd like you to stand up real quick, please. Because this is another project, and it's really about, and I'm not going to use this, it's really about, I guess,
Oh, now you're all sitting again. So thank you very much, Steffen, for the great talk. That was a wonderful transition into the conversation that's going to take place outside on yoga balls. So now we're all sort of warmed up. We do have time to have just a quick round of questions, but if it's a more general question, I suggest you remember them and take them into the discussion with our other great guests, Friedrich von Borries, who's over there, and Holly Gramazio somewhere outside, and Natalie Pozzi, which will explore a lot of the broader issues of architecture and play. So are there any questions right away, or do you want to take them to the yoga balls? You? No. Questions?
Can they also be comments?
Yes, comment.
I'm sorry, I can't help. I liked a lot how you ended the lecture, but I can't help being critical to the way you started it, with showing these examples of what we consider as gameful architecture. Personally, I don't think like painting a bunch of huge cubes colorful, is playful at all, because they don't engage people do anything, rather just seeing something. So I think today there are some examples of playful architecture, but that goes more into social experiments where architects work together with communities, or architects who try to find gaps in politics and in the law, and build things that they cannot be removed because there's no law about it, or examples like this that they are less superficial than the ones you showed us.
I agree.
But I can understand that somehow it helped you to go to the end of the. So I think you did it on purpose, showing us these examples, or not. I don't know.
Do you want to react?
Yeah. Quickly, briefly, I do agree. Yeah. All this is superficial. You said it yourself, and it's not. It's sometimes sort of invites activity. And that's when it reaches that point, then it becomes interesting. I think it's about activity.
Yeah.
But a lot of architects don't know that. Well, that's because they are not trained to think in activities. Some are. Most of them are not. They are trained to think in terms of form.
Yeah, that's right.
Very good. We'll see what the other architects in the conversation have to say about that. So now let's do something.